Out in the middle of the Arizona desert, where the sun beats down like a hammer on an anvil, a lone rider saw something that would change his life forever. His name was Thomas Blackwood, and his job was simple: carry the mail, ask no questions, and keep moving. For 3 years, that's exactly what he'd done. The silence suited him. The emptiness of the landscape matched the emptiness in his soul, a hollowed-out space left behind by the war. But on this day, the emptiness was broken. Overhead, buzzards circled, not one or two, but a dozen of them, riding the heat waves in lazy, patient spirals. Thomas knew what that meant. Where there are buzzards, there is death. And out here, death rarely came with dignity. He pulled his worn hat lower, his eyes scanning the cracked earth. His horse, Whiskey, snorted, sensing her rider's unease. The mail had to be delivered. That was the job. He had letters from husbands to wives, promises from sons to mothers. He was just a messenger, not a hero. He'd tried being a hero once, and the ghosts of the men he'd failed to save still rode with him every single day. He should have kept riding. He knew he should have. But something pulled him toward those circling birds. A flicker of movement, a shape on the horizon that didn't belong. It wasn't a cactus or a rock formation. It was something man-made. A single wooden post, thick as a man's arm, driven deep into the desert floor. Thomas reined Whiskey in, his hand instinctively resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. What was a post doing out here? Miles from any trail, any settlement, any sign of life. As he got closer, he saw a splash of color at its base, a faded patch of blue fabric, stark against the endless brown. He called out, his voice cracking from disuse. "Hello?" The desert swallowed the sound whole. The only answer was the screech of a hawk and the silent, circling judgment of the buzzards. He dismounted, grabbing the shovel strapped to his saddle. If someone had died out here, the least he could do was give them a proper burial. He'd seen too many men left for the elements. As he walked closer, the smell hit him. Not death, not decay. Something worse. The sour, metallic scent of fear. He saw the blue fabric more clearly now. It was a child's dress. His heart hammered against his ribs. He started to run. At the base of the post, he found her. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, slumped against the wood. Her hands were bound behind her with thick rope. The knots professional, efficient, and cruel. For a terrifying second, he thought he was too late. Then her small chest rose with a shallow, ragged breath. She was alive, but it was the thing hanging around her neck that made his blood run ice cold. A rough wooden board, hung with a leather cord. Someone had taken a hot iron and burned 4 words into the wood. 4 words that sealed a fate worse than death. Not worth feeding. Thomas dropped to his knees, his breath catching in his throat. The girl's eyes fluttered open. They were the color of new spring grass, and they held a terror so profound it stole the air from his lungs. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. "Water," she whispered. He fumbled for his canteen, his hands shaking. He'd seen men torn apart by cannonballs, fields littered with the dead. But this was a different kind of evil. A quiet, deliberate cruelty that was somehow more monstrous than the chaos of war. "Easy now," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. "I've got you." He let her drink in small sips as he worked on the knots binding her wrists. The rope was cinched so tight it had broken the skin. Whoever did this wanted her to suffer. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Ellie." She looked at him, her gaze surprisingly steady. "My pa left me here. He said there wasn't enough food for both of us." The casual brutality of it was like a punch to the gut. A father abandoning his own child in the middle of nowhere, with a sign declaring her worthless. Thomas felt a rage building inside him, a hot, dark thing he thought he'd buried long ago. He took the cruel sign from her neck, intending to smash it to pieces. But as he turned it over, his heart stopped. On the back, scratched into the wood with the tip of a knife, were more words. A hidden message meant only for the person who was supposed to find her. For Thomas Blackwood. His name. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a message, a trap. Someone knew his route. Someone knew he would be the one to pass this way. And they had left this child here for him, a living, breathing accusation. This was revenge. Thomas quickly shoved the sign into his saddlebag, his mind racing. Who would do this? Who hated him this much? The answer came to him in a flash of memory, a face from the war, twisted in grief and anger. James Miller, a good soldier who died under his command. Ellie, he said, his voice tight. What's your last name? Miller, she whispered, her eyes full of confusion. Eleanor Miller. Did you know my pa? He hadn't known her father, but he had known her uncle, James. He remembered James talking about his brother William, a man who had never forgiven the Union, never forgiven the officers who'd sent his brother to his death. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her father, William Miller, had done this. He had sacrificed his own daughter to settle a score with the man he blamed for his brother's death. We served together, was all he could say, the simplest, most painful truth. He lifted her into his arms. She was impossibly light, a bundle of bones and fragile courage. He carried her back to whiskey, his mind a whirlwind of questions. His simple life of delivering mail was over. He had just picked up the most important package of his life, and he had a terrifying feeling that the sender was watching his every move. The desert was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of his past, and they were closing in. He had to get her to safety. The nearest town was Silver Creek, a day's ride east. He settled Ellie in front of him on the saddle, her small body rigid against his. She was terrified of him, a stranger who had appeared out of the vast, empty wasteland. He couldn't blame her. As they rode, the sky began to darken, not with night, but with the bruised purple of an approaching storm. Lightning spiderwebbed across the horizon. A desert storm was no small thing. It could turn the dry earth into a raging river in minutes. Where are we going? Ellie's voice was a muffled whisper against his chest. A town called Silver Creek, he answered. There's a doctor there. What he didn't say was what would happen after that. What do you do with a child left as an instrument of revenge? An orphan in a land that had little room for charity? He spurred whiskey on, trying to outrun the storm, trying to outrun the questions that plagued him. He spotted a rocky overhang just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. He guided the horse under the shallow shelter as the sky opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, and thunder cracked so loud it felt like the world was splitting apart. He built a small fire, the flames pushing back the sudden chill. Ellie huddled by the warmth, her eyes wide as she watched the storm. He offered her some jerky, and she ate it slowly, carefully, like she wasn't sure it was real. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice small but clear over the roar of the rain. You saw the back of the sign, didn't you? He froze. He thought he'd hidden it from her. You saw my name, he admitted. Why? She asked, her gaze direct, unflinching. Why would my pa write your name? He owed her the truth, or at least a piece of it. During the war, he began, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I was your Uncle James's commanding officer. I had to make a choice, an impossible choice. It saved a lot of people, but your uncle didn't make it. She processed this with a solemnity far beyond her years. So my pa left me for you, because he blames you. I think so, Thomas said, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. To his astonishment, she reached out and put her small, trembling hand on his arm. Uncle James wouldn't have wanted that, she said with a certainty that shook him to his core. Ma always said he was the kindest of all the Millers. She said he didn't believe in revenge. This child who had every reason to hate the world was offering him comfort. It was a simple, profound act of grace that cracked open the armor he'd built around his heart. They spent the night in that small shelter, the storm raging outside. As Ellie slept, curled in his bedroll, Thomas kept watch. He looked at her face in the dying firelight and saw the unmistakable features of James Miller, the promise he'd made to a dying James on a muddy battlefield. Take care of them, came back to him with the force of a physical blow. He'd thought James meant his men, but what if he'd meant his family? Was this William's revenge, or was it something else? A chance at redemption, delivered to him in the form of a small, forgotten girl. By morning, the storm had passed. The desert air was washed clean, and tiny wildflowers had miraculously bloomed in the damp earth. As they rode towards Silver Creek, Ellie pointed them out, naming each one. Her mother had taught her. She said flowers are tougher than they look, Ellie said. Like someone else I know, Thomas replied, earning a small, shy smile. They saw Silver Creek just before noon, a small cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a valley. Hope began to stir in Thomas's chest. A doctor, a sheriff, a safe place for Ellie. Maybe things would be all right. But as they rode down the main street, Thomas felt a prickling on the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched. He glanced across the street toward the shadows between the general store and the livery stable. A man stood there, dressed in a dark coat despite the heat. His face was obscured by shadow, but Thomas could feel the intensity of his gaze. When their eyes met, the man didn't look away. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that was not a greeting, but a confirmation. I see you. I've been waiting. Then just as quickly, the man melted back into the shadows and was gone. A cold dread washed over Thomas. This wasn't just about William Miller's grief-stricken revenge anymore. There was someone else involved. Someone professional, someone patient. The trap wasn't just the girl on the post. The trap was this entire town. And he had just ridden straight into it. The man in the shadows had rattled him, but Ellie was his priority. He guided Whiskey toward the doctor's office, trying to shake the feeling of being a fly caught in a spider's web. Before they could reach it, a woman stepped out of a small building, a sign above it reading, Silver Creek Schoolhouse. She carried a stack of books and nearly collided with them. "Oh my goodness, I do beg your pardon," she said, looking up. She had warm, intelligent eyes and a kind face. When she saw Ellie, her expression shifted instantly to one of deep concern. "Is this child all right?" "We're on our way to see the doctor," Thomas said. "Found her out in the desert." The woman's compassion was genuine. "I'm Clara Montgomery, the school teacher." She spoke directly to Ellie, her voice gentle. "What's your name, dear?" Ellie hesitated, glancing at Thomas for permission. He nodded. "Eleanor Miller, ma'am." A flicker of recognition crossed Clara's face. It was there and gone in a second, but Thomas saw it. "Well, Ellie," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm very glad Mr. Blackwood," Thomas supplied. "Thomas Blackwood." Clara's smile froze for a split second. She knew the names, both of them. The chances of this being a coincidence were shrinking by the second. "The doctor might be out on a call," Clara said, recovering quickly. "My cottage is just behind the school. Why don't you bring her there? I can get her cleaned up and give her something to eat while we wait for him." Thomas's instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to trust no one. But Ellie looked up at him, her eyes pleading. The thought of a warm meal and a bath was a luxury she hadn't dared to dream of. He couldn't deny her that. He relented. "That's very kind of you, Miss Montgomery." Clara's cottage was small and tidy, but one thing stood out. Books. They were everywhere, lining shelves, stacked on tables, piled in corners. Ellie's eyes went wide. "You have so many books," she breathed. "Each one is a different world waiting to be explored," Clara said with a genuine smile. While Clara heated up some stew, Thomas told her a sanitized version of how he'd found Ellie. He left out the sign with his name, the connection to the Miller family. For now, he needed to gather information, not give it away. Clara listened, her horror growing. How could any father do such a thing? "Grief makes people do terrible things," Thomas said, the words feeling hollow. After they ate, Clara led Ellie to a small room to get her washed up. "Perhaps you could go and find Sheriff Palmer," she suggested to Thomas. "Let him know what's happened. His office is across from the general store." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. She wanted to speak with Ellie alone. Thomas knew it, but he had no choice but to agree. He needed to talk to the sheriff anyway. Sheriff Palmer was a stout, no-nonsense man who listened to Thomas's story with a grim expression. "An abandoned child," Palmer sighed, making a note in his ledger. "We'll have to send telegrams. Try to find any next of kin." "She's staying with the school teacher for now," Thomas said. Palmer raised an eyebrow. "Clara Montgomery? She's a good woman, but she keeps to herself, surprised she'd taken a stranger. He eyed Thomas. You planning on sticking around Blackwood? Or are you heading out on your route tomorrow? The question hung in the air. The old Thomas, the man he was just 2 days ago, would have been gone by sunrise. But now, not sure yet, he admitted. Depends on the girl. As he left the sheriff's office, he felt that same prickling on his neck again. The man in the dark coat was back, standing in the exact same spot across the street. This time, he wasn't just watching, he was waiting. As Thomas started towards him, the man turned and walked calmly into the livery stable. Thomas followed, his hand on his colt. The stable was dark and smelled of hay and horses. The man was nowhere to be seen, but something was on the ground, placed deliberately in the center of the walkway. A single spent rifle cartridge, polished until it gleamed. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise of violence to come. Thomas picked it up. It was still warm. The man had been there just seconds ago. He was toying with him. He hurried back to Clara's cottage, his unease turning to cold fear. When he arrived, Clara was waiting for him on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale. She told me everything, Clara said, her voice a low whisper. About her father, William, about the sign, about you. She looked him straight in the eye. And she told me something else, something you don't know. Her mother, Margaret, her death wasn't from a fever. Thomas stared at her. What are you saying? Ellie said her father had been drinking, arguing with her mother the night she died. There was a fall. He told everyone it was a fever that took her in the night. Clara's voice trembled. Thomas, I don't think William abandoned Ellie just for revenge. I think he was getting rid of a witness. The foundation of what Thomas thought he knew crumbled. This wasn't about a wartime grudge anymore. It was about a dark, deadly secret. But that wasn't the biggest shock. There's more, Clara said, her eyes filled with a pain that looked years old. I didn't just recognize the Miller name. I knew them. I lived with them. Before I came to Silver Creek, I was Ellie's tutor in Tucson. The spider's web had just gotten infinitely more complex. The school teacher wasn't a random Samaritan. She was a piece of the puzzle, a ghost from the Miller family's past. Why did you leave? Thomas asked, his voice low. Clara looked away toward the distant mountains. Because William Miller wasn't a good man, even then. And because Margaret was my friend, and she had a secret of her own. She took a shaky breath and looked back at him, her eyes locking onto his. The night before I left Tucson, Margaret confessed something to me. She was terrified of her husband's temper. She told me that if anything ever happened to her, she had written a letter, explaining everything. She said she hid it somewhere no one would ever think to look. Where? Thomas demanded. She sewed it into the lining of Ellie's favorite doll, Clara whispered. A doll that Ellie told me her father threw into the fire the night her mother died. The letter was gone. The proof was destroyed, or so William Miller thought. He didn't throw it in the fire, a small voice said from the doorway. Ellie stood there, clean and dressed in borrowed clothes, her eyes wide. He missed, she said. I saved it. It's in my bag. Thomas and Clara stared, speechless. William Miller's entire carefully constructed lie was about to be unraveled by an 8-year-old girl and a worn-out toy. But as relief flooded through him, a new, colder thought took its place. If William had abandoned his daughter to hide a murder, and the proof of that murder still existed, he wouldn't stop looking for her. He would hunt her to the ends of the earth to get that doll back. And the man in the dark coat? He wasn't working for William. Thomas was sure of it. He was a different kind of predator, one who had been drawn by the scent of chaos and opportunity. The three of them, a haunted rider, a runaway teacher, and a little girl holding a deadly secret, were trapped. The town of Silver Creek was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the hunters were closing in. Ellie retrieved the doll from the small satchel she carried. It was a simple rag doll, its yarn hair frayed, one button eye missing. It looked like 1,000 other toys a child might cherish. But hidden within its cloth body was a dead woman's testimony, a truth powerful enough to get them all killed. We can't stay here, Thomas said, his mind racing. Holloway, the man in the dark coat, He's not just watching, he's waiting for the right moment to make a move. And William Miller could already be on his way here. Holloway? Clara's eyes widened. Vincent Holloway? Thomas spun around. You know him? I don't know him personally, she said, her voice tight with fear. But I know the name. When I was in Tucson before I worked for the Millers, I read the newspapers. Holloway was a bounty hunter, a man who found people for a living. He was hired by a wealthy man from back east, a man named Ezra Miller. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Ezra Miller, William and James's father, the family patriarch who, according to James, had disowned William for marrying beneath his station. Ezra Miller is looking for his family? Thomas asked, bewildered. He was, Clara said. He hired Holloway to find William and his family, to try and reconcile. The notice ran in the paper for months. This changed everything. Holloway wasn't some random predator. He was on a job that had led him right to the heart of this mess. But why was he playing this cat and mouse game? Why hadn't he just approached them, unless his motives had changed? The telegrams, Thomas said, the pieces clicking into place. Sheriff Palmer is sending telegrams to find Ellie's next of kin. When Ezra Miller gets that message, he'll know exactly where she is. And so will Holloway. They were running out of time. Every tick of the clock was another step closer to discovery. Clara's face was pale in the lamplight. What do? We can't outrun them. Not with a child. No, Thomas said, his gaze hardening. We don't run. We set a trap of our own. He looked from Clara to Ellie. But I need to know everything. Clara, why did you really leave the Millers? Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. William. He became obsessed. He made advances. I couldn't stay. I couldn't betray Margaret. But I feel like I abandoned her. If I had stayed, maybe. You would be dead too, Thomas said grimly. You did the only thing you could. He turned to Ellie. Ellie, you said your pa missed when he threw the doll in the fire. What happened? He was drunk, Ellie said, her voice small and steady. He yelled at Ma, and she fell and hit her head on the hearth. She didn't get up. He told me she was sleeping. The next morning he told me the fever took her. He was burning her thing, her dress, her books. He threw the doll, but it hit the mantel and fell behind the wood box. I got it later when he was passed out. A clumsy, drunken murder, a clumsy cover-up, and it was all about to fall apart. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed from the front door. It wasn't a friendly rap. It was the hard, insistent pound of authority. Clara Montgomery, open up! Sheriff Palmer! They froze. Had he found out already? Thomas motioned for Clara and Ellie to stay back, his hand moving to his Colt as he approached the door. He peered through the window. It was the sheriff, and he wasn't alone. The man in the dark coat, Vincent Holloway, stood right beside him, a piece of paper in his hand, and he was smiling. Miss Montgomery, the sheriff called out again, his voice strained. This man, Mr. Holloway, has a telegram. It's from a Mr. Ezra Miller of Boston. It seems he's the girl's grandfather. He's been notified of her whereabouts, and he's granted Mr. Holloway full authority to act as his agent and take custody of his granddaughter. It was over. Holloway had won. He had used the law itself as his weapon. They were cornered, legally and completely. Thomas looked at Clara, a silent question in his eyes. She understood immediately. She went to the back room, where Ellie was hiding. Thomas could hear her whispering urgently. He opened the front door. Sheriff. Holloway's smile widened. He looked past Thomas into the house. Blackwood. I knew I'd find you here, always playing the hero. His eyes were cold like chips of ice. I'll be taking the girl now, by the authority of her legal guardian. You're not taking her anywhere, Thomas said, his voice a low growl. Holloway chuckled. Are you going to draw on me in front of the town sheriff? I have the law on my side. You are interfering with a legal custody transfer. The sheriff here would have to arrest you. Palmer looked deeply uncomfortable. He's right, Blackwood. My hands are tied. The telegram is official. It was a perfect trap. Every move they made would only tighten the noose. Just then, Clara emerged from the back of the cottage. Her face was a mask of cold fury, but she was alone. Holloway's smile vanished. Where is she? Where is the girl? She's gone, Clara said, her voice ringing with defiance. What? Holloway took a step forward, his hand dropping to the gun on his hip. While you were busy knocking, she slipped out the back window, Clara said. She's a smart girl. She knows a predator when she sees one. Holloway's face twisted into a snarl. He turned to Palmer. Seal the town. No one gets in or out. Find that girl. As the sheriff hurried off to raise the alarm, Holloway turned back to Thomas and Clara. The friendly mask was gone, replaced by the face of the killer he truly was. You think you're clever, he hissed. You've just signed her death warrant. And yours. What do you really want, Holloway? Thomas asked, stepping between him and Clara. This isn't about custody. You could have taken her quietly. You wanted a confrontation. You wanted me. I want justice, Holloway spat, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. I was in Tennessee, Blackwood. I was the sergeant who had to pull the bodies of those 19 men out of the mud after you flooded that valley. 19 men you sacrificed. One of them was my younger brother. He was only 17. The final piece fell into place. This was never about Ezra Miller's money. It was about blood. Now, Holloway said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, you're going to help me find that girl, and you're going to give me what she's carrying, the doll. I know all about Margaret's little insurance policy. William wasn't as clever as he thought. He confessed everything when he thought I was his friend. Why do you want the doll? Clara asked, her voice trembling. Because Ezra Miller is paying me a fortune to find his granddaughter, Holloway said with a cruel smile. But a man named William Miller is paying me even more to make sure the evidence of his wife's murder disappears forever, along with the only witness. He looked from Thomas to Clara. He wants his daughter dead, and I'm going to deliver. The sheer, layered evil of it was breathtaking. Holloway was playing both sides, milking a family's tragedy for every cent it was worth, all while orchestrating his own personal revenge. The girl is gone, Holloway, Thomas said. You'll never find her. Holloway laughed, a short, ugly sound. Oh, I think I will, because I have the one thing that will bring her running back. He drew his gun with lightning speed, but he didn't point it at Thomas. He pointed it at Clara. You're going to find her for me, Blackwood, Holloway snarled, or the school teacher dies right here on her pretty little porch. And then I'll burn this whole town to the ground to find that girl. You have 1 hour. The clock is ticking. He shoved Clara toward Thomas, his gun never wavering. Go. And don't think for a second I won't do it. Thomas grabbed Clara's arm, his mind a maelstrom of panic and fury. He had to get her away, but he also had to find Ellie. She hadn't actually run. It was a bluff. She was hidden, somewhere in the tiny cottage. But where? As he pulled Clara back into the house, his eyes scanned the room, desperately looking for a sign, a clue. Ellie was smart, but she was still just a child. Where would a child hide? Then he saw it. On the floor near the hearth where her mother had died was a single piece of chalk. And on the dark stone of the hearth, almost invisible in the dim light, was a single hastily drawn symbol. A flower. A desert marigold. Tougher than they look. It was a message. She wasn't in the cottage. She had run. And she was heading for the one place she'd mentioned. The one place she associated with her mother's strength. The desert. Holloway thought he had them trapped, but he'd underestimated them. He'd underestimated a grieving man's promise. He'd underestimated a brave woman's love. And he'd underestimated a little girl's courage. The hunt was on. But it wasn't Thomas who was the prey anymore. He was the hunter now, and he was coming for Vincent Holloway. The hour Holloway had given them was a death sentence. There was no way to find Ellie in the desert and get back in time. It was a lie, a way to get Thomas out of the way so Holloway could search the cottage himself. He knew Ellie hadn't gone far. He's not going to wait an hour, Thomas said to Clara as they backed away from the front door. He'll come in as soon as we're out of sight. Ellie's not here, Clara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The flower on the hearth. Our cottage has a root cellar. The door is under the rug by the fireplace. I showed her yesterday. She's down there. Relief and terror warred inside him. Ellie was close. Too close. You have to get her out of there, Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. There's a loose board in the back wall of the pantry. It leads under the house. Can you get to it without him seeing you? Clara nodded, her face grim. What are you going to do? I'm going to give him the distraction he wants, Thomas said. He looked at her, the words he'd kept locked away for years suddenly fighting to get out. Clara, if something happens, don't, she said, her hand finding his. You come back. Both of you. It was all he needed. He slipped out the back door and circled around the side of the schoolhouse. The main street was in chaos. Men were grabbing rifles, organizing a search party under the direction of a frantic Sheriff Palmer. Holloway stood on Clara's porch, a king surveying his domain, his gun held loosely at his side. He was enjoying this. Thomas had to draw him away from the cottage. He saw his chance. Across the street, the livery stable was a tinder box of dry hay and stored lamp oil. A fire would be the ultimate distraction. It would bring every man in town running, including Holloway. But it was risky, incredibly risky. He darted across the street using the chaos as cover. He slipped into the stable. The smell of hay and horseflesh thick in the air. He grabbed a lantern, knocked the glass chimney off, and tipped it over into a pile of loose straw. Whoosh! The flames erupted with a hungry roar. Thomas didn't wait to see the result. He ran out the back of the stable and circled around behind the buildings, making his way back toward the cottage. He had to be there when Clara and Ellie came out. Shouts erupted from the main street. Fire! The livery's on fire! Thomas risked a glance. Men were running, abandoning the search for Ellie, buckets in hand. And just as he'd predicted, Holloway was off the porch, his head turned toward the growing column of black smoke, his face a mask of fury. His perfect plan was literally going up in smoke. This was their chance. He reached the back of Clara's cottage just as a small figure crawled out from beneath the house covered in dust and cobwebs. Ellie. Clara was right behind her. Ellie saw Thomas and ran into his arms, burying her face in his chest. She was trembling, but she wasn't crying. She clutched the rag doll tight in one hand. You came back, she whispered. I'll always come back for you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. The fire was growing, the roar of the flames audible even from here. They had moments, maybe seconds, before Holloway realized he'd been tricked. The horses, Clara said. They're still tied out front. It was their only way out, but it meant going back into the open. Stay behind me, Thomas ordered. They moved low and fast, hugging the wall of the cottage. They reached the front corner and peered around. Holloway was shouting orders, trying to get the men to focus on finding Ellie instead of fighting the fire. But they were ignoring him. The stable was the lifeblood of the town. Losing it was unthinkable. Whiskey and the horse Clara had rented were still at the hitching post, their eyes wide with fear from the smoke and noise. Now, Thomas whispered. They broke cover, running for the horses. They were halfway there when a voice cut through the chaos. Blackwood! Holloway had seen them. He raised his pistol, ignoring the fire, ignoring the townspeople. His eyes were locked on Thomas, burning with pure hatred. Time slowed down. Thomas shoved Ellie toward Clara. Get her on the horse, go! He drew his Colt, turning to face Holloway. This was it, the confrontation that had been brewing since a rainy day in Tennessee. Two men, two guns, with the whole town as their backdrop. Holloway fired. The bullet whistled past Thomas's ear, close enough to feel the heat. Thomas fired back. His shot was true, kicking up dirt at Holloway's feet, forcing him to take cover behind a water trough. Clara had Ellie on whiskey and was scrambling up behind her. Thomas, come on! Another shot from Holloway splintered the hitching post next to Thomas's head. He had to give them more time. He laid down suppressing fire, forcing Holloway to stay down. The heat from the burning stable was intense, sweat pouring down his face, the smoke stinging his eyes. He saw his chance. Holloway had to reload. Thomas turned and sprinted for Clara's horse, grabbing the reins and swinging into the saddle in one smooth motion. He kicked the horse into a gallop, leaning low over its neck as another bullet whizzed past. They thundered out of town, leaving the fire, the chaos, and Vincent Holloway behind them. For a moment, Thomas thought they had made it. They were free. But as they cleared the last of the buildings and hit the open desert, Thomas heard it. The one sound he'd been dreading, the thunder of more horses. Not one. At least half a dozen. He looked back. Holloway wasn't alone. He had men. They were pouring out of the alley beside the general store, a posse of hired guns who had been waiting in the wings the whole time. Holloway had anticipated everything, even the fire, even their escape. The chase was on. They were outnumbered and riding into the vast, unforgiving wilderness with a team of professional killers on their tail. Whiskey was a strong horse, but she was carrying double. They couldn't outrun them for long. "We have to split up," Thomas yelled to Clara over the pounding of hooves. "It's me they want. Take Ellie and ride east toward Fort Grant. Don't stop for anything." "No!" Clara shouted back, her face streaked with soot and determination. "We're not leaving you." "You have to," he insisted. "Keep her safe. That's all that matters. I'll lead them away." He saw the anguish in her eyes, the terrible choice he was forcing on her. But she knew he was right. She gave a sharp, reluctant nod. "There's a canyon about 5 miles south," he yelled. "It's called Diablo's Spine. I can lose them in the rocks. I'll meet you at the fort." He peeled off, turning his horse south, hoping the posse would follow their primary target. For a few heart-stopping seconds, they didn't. They continued straight after Clara and Ellie. Thomas's blood ran cold. He had to do something desperate. He stood up in his stirrups, raised his revolver to the sky, and fired 2 shots. "Come and get me, Holloway," he roared, his voice raw. "This is between you and me." It worked. The riders wavered, then turned, leaving 2 of their number to continue after Clara, while Holloway and the main group veered south, after him. He had bought them time, but he had just signed his own death warrant. He was riding straight into a dead-end canyon with a pack of wolves at his heels. The rock formations of Diablo's Spine rose up ahead of him, twisted spires of red rock that looked like the bones of some ancient monster. It was a maze of dead ends and narrow passages, a perfect place for an ambush, a perfect place to die. He pushed his horse harder, the animal's lungs burning. The posse was gaining on him. Bullets started kicking up dust around him. He weaved through the rocks, using the terrain for cover. He rounded a sharp bend and saw his chance. A narrow fissure in the rock wall, barely wide enough for a horse. He plunged into the darkness. He dismounted, slapping his horse on the rump to send it running on through the canyon. A decoy. He flattened himself against the cold stone of the fissure, his breathing ragged, his Colt clutched in his hand. He heard the posse thunder past the opening, following the sound of his horse. He had a few minutes at best. He had to find a better position, a defensible one. He scrambled up the rocks, his boots finding precarious holds. He pulled himself onto a high ledge that overlooked the canyon floor. From here, he could see them. Holloway and his men, realizing they'd been tricked, were turning back, dismounting to search the rocks on foot. He was trapped, 5 against 1. But Thomas Blackwood had been in impossible situations before. He had learned one thing from the war. When you're cornered, you don't wait for the enemy to come to you. You bring the fight to them. He checked his revolver. 4 shots left. He took a deep breath, the ghosts of 19 dead men at his side. He wasn't just fighting for his own life anymore. He was fighting for Clara. He was fighting for Ellie. He was fighting for his last chance at redemption. He sighted down the barrel at the first of Holloway's men and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon like the crack of doom. One of the hired guns crumpled to the ground. The others scattered, firing wildly up at the rocks. Thomas ducked back behind cover as bullets ricocheted around him, sending chips of stone flying. He had their attention. He moved, scrambling along the ledge to a new position. They expected him to stay put. He wouldn't make it that easy. He popped up, fired again, and took another man down. 3 left, Holloway and 2 others. "He's on the high ledge," Holloway yelled. "Spread out, flush him down." They were professionals. They started working their way up the rocks from 2 different directions, trying to flank him. Thomas was pinned. He fired his last 2 shots, forcing them back, but he knew it was a temporary victory. He was out of ammunition. He slid his empty Colt back into its holster and drew his knife. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. He pressed himself into a crevice, listening to the scrape of their boots on the rock as they got closer. This was it, the end of the line. He thought of Ellie's face, of Clara's defiant eyes. He had failed them. "Nowhere left to run, Blackwood." Holloway's voice was close, too close. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension. A sharp, piercing whistle from the far end of the canyon. Holloway and his men froze. "What was that?" one of them whispered. The whistle came again, followed by the crack of a rifle. Not a pistol, a long gun. The bullet slammed into the rock wall just inches from Holloway's head. "Ambush!" the other man yelled. "We've been set up!" Holloway cursed, his eyes scanning the canyon rim. "Who's up there?" Thomas didn't know, but he wasn't going to waste the opportunity. He burst from his hiding place, knife in hand, and tackled the nearest gunman. They went tumbling down the rocky slope, a tangle of limbs and fury. Thomas came out on top, his knife at the man's throat. The other gunman turned, raising his pistol, but another rifle shot rang out, and the man dropped his weapon, clutching a shattered wrist. Holloway was alone. He looked from his injured men to the unseen sniper, then down at Thomas. His face was a mask of disbelief and rage. His perfect plan had completely unraveled. He made a run for it, scrambling back toward the horses. But as he reached the canyon floor, a figure stepped out from behind a boulder, blocking his path. It was Sheriff Palmer. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead. His uniform was torn, but he was holding a Winchester rifle, steady in his hands. "It's over, Holloway," Palmer said, his voice hard as iron. Holloway skidded to a stop, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He raised his hands in surrender. "All right, Sheriff, you got me." But as Palmer stepped forward, Holloway moved like a snake. He dropped one hand, pulling a second, smaller pistol from a holster hidden in his boot. He fired. The shot went wide, because at that exact moment, another figure charged out from the rocks, slamming into Holloway's side with the force of a battering ram. It was Ezra Miller. The old man had followed them. He must have gotten a horse from the chaos at the livery and come after them. He wasn't a fighter, but he was furious. He grappled with Holloway, trying to get the gun. "You tried to kill my granddaughter," Miller roared, his face purple with rage. "You used my son's memory to justify your greed." Holloway was stronger. He threw Miller to the ground and leveled the pistol at his head. Thomas didn't think. He ran. He launched himself at Holloway, a desperate flying tackle. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. Pain exploded in Thomas's side. A searing, white-hot fire. He collapsed on top of Holloway, the world spinning into a gray fog. He heard more shouting, another gunshot, but it all seemed very far away. His last conscious thought was of a promise made to a dying man. Take care of them. He had tried. He hoped it was enough. When Thomas woke, the first thing he saw was Clara's face. She was sitting by his bed, her hand holding his. They weren't in a canyon. They were in a clean, quiet room. Sunlight streamed through the window. "You're at Fort Grant," she said, her voice soft. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she was smiling. "You've been unconscious for 2 days." He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his side made him gasp. He looked down. He was bandaged from his ribs to his hip. "Holloway shot you," Clara explained. "The bullet went clean through, but you lost a lot of blood. Sheriff Palmer, he killed Holloway right after. Said it was the last mistake Holloway would ever make." "Palmer?" Thomas asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He's fine," Clara said. "He followed us out of town. He said he never trusted Holloway and knew something was wrong. Ezra Miller is fine too. Banged up, but mostly just his pride is wounded." She squeezed his hand. "You saved his life, Thomas." "Ellie?" It was the only question that mattered. Clara's smile widened. "She's right outside. She refuses to leave. She's been reading to you. Robinson Crusoe. She's gotten through the whole book twice." The door opened and Ellie peeked in. When she saw he was awake, her face broke into a radiant smile. She ran to the bed, the rag doll clutched in her hand. "You kept your promise," she said. "I told you I would," he managed to say. Later that day, the territorial marshal came to take their statements. The doll and the letter sewn inside it told the whole story. Margaret Miller's last words were a damning indictment of her husband. A warrant was issued for William Miller's arrest for murder. He was caught a week later in a saloon in Mexico, a broken, drunken man. Ezra Miller was a changed man. The shock of the events and the courage of the granddaughter he'd never met had broken through his pride. He came to see Thomas before he left for Boston. "I was wrong about so many things," the old man said, his voice heavy with regret. "About my son, about his wife, about you. He looked at Thomas, his eyes clear. She's better off here, with you and Miss Montgomery, but she is still a Miller, and a Miller deserves an education. He made a proposition. He would fund the construction of a new school in Silver Creek, the finest school in the territory, complete with a library that would rival any in the East. He would create a trust for Ellie, ensuring she would never want for anything. All he asked in return was to be allowed to write to her, to be a part of her life, even from a distance. It was an offer they couldn't refuse. A few weeks later, Thomas was well enough to ride. He, Clara, and Ellie left Fort Grant and made their way back to Silver Creek. It was a different town they returned to. The livery stable was already being rebuilt. The people who had heard the whole story from Sheriff Palmer greeted them not as strangers but as neighbors, as heroes. Thomas stood with Clara on the porch of her small cottage, watching Ellie play in the yard with some of the other children. The sun was setting, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple. The Postal Service had sent word. His route was being held for him, if he wanted it. "Are you going to take it?" Clara asked, her eyes searching his. Thomas looked at Ellie, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. He looked at Clara, the strong, brave woman who had faced down a killer to protect a child. He thought of the empty miles, the lonely nights. He'd spent years riding, searching for something he couldn't name, a way to quiet the ghosts. He realized now the ghosts would always be there, but they didn't have to ride alone. "No," he said, turning to Clara. He took her hand, his rough fingers lacing with hers. "I think my deliveries are done. I think I'm finally home." She smiled, a true, brilliant smile that lit up her whole face. And in that moment, Thomas Blackwood knew that the promise he'd made on a bloody battlefield all those years ago had finally truly been kept. He had taken care of them, and in doing so, they had taken care of him. The desert was no longer empty. It was full of life and hope and the promise of a new day. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of survival, mystery, and the hidden corners of history, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join us for the next adventure. You never know what secrets are buried out there, just waiting to be found.